Well, it's very good to be here. A picture from regional, international standpoints. I'd like to begin with an expert who comes from Darfur, who has been very much involved in the human rights struggle, based here in Washington. Niemat is going to please begin telling us a little bit about the situation on the ground in Sudan over the past few weeks, past few months.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity. I'm very pleased to be with you here today to speak to you about the situation in Sudan. Unfortunately, we have been speaking about Sudan for so many years, and so things are only getting worse every day. Speaking about the recent development in Sudan, so the recent development is the consequences of the long-standing crisis that has been going on in Sudan for years. On June 3rd, the Transitional Military Council has ordered killing and burning of the tents of peaceful protesters who have staged a protest and organized a sit-in place, believing that the military can stand in their side and help them achieve the dream of change in Sudan. They are demanding nothing but freedom, peace, and justice. Unfortunately, they cracked down on the protester, killing well over 100 people and injuring several thousands. And there are report of disappearance, people who have been picked from their homes, people who their whereabouts is not known until today. People were taken driving in the street, going to the hospital, they are stopped and taken out and whipped by the military. So today, Sudan is one of the most dangerous places to be in. And this was as a result of 4 months of protests started in December 19, when Sudanese across the Sudan came together and decided that things in Sudan has to change and demanded that President al-Bashir peacefully step down. What was the response? President Bashir's response was brutal. Killing, arresting, torturing people, as this is the norm that he has been using in Sudan for years. And but the determination of the people of Sudan was beyond the separation and the aggressive approach that the government has taken against this demonstrator. They continued and insisted until finally al-Bashir was forced to step down. But to me, I don't think he has to step down, but they played a game of exchanging seat to provide protection for themselves. And why the people of Sudan has protested in the first place? They protested because this government is not a legitimate government, and unfortunately, it came to power by coup, a military coup that was orchestrated in 1989. What the government did, they started breaching, trying to reorient the Sudanese society into a new fundamentalist approach to Islam, forcing people to start changing their values and following strictly the new fundamentalist type of Islam. Many people have protested that, and among them were the people of Darfur, and they were mistakenly thinking that the people of Darfur will be following them. So they, in 1990s, they hosted, they involved with all the extremist group, including Osama bin Laden was in Khartoum. This led to Sudan being under United States sanction. Sudan has been designated as terrorist-sponsored country and put under some economic sanctions since then by President Bill Clinton. So Sudan has experienced isolation, but during that isolation, they took another route and tried to rally themselves behind the same trouble people in the region that they were first were put or held accountable for by the international community. They continue to destroy the people of Sudan while enriching themselves. And in 2003, 2002, they launched a genocidal campaign against the people of Darfur. Unfortunately, they created an approach that they rally the people from the Arab origin against the indigenous African people in Darfur. They murdered people, burned villages, looted property, destroyed food and water. This resulted in over 4.7 million people have been affected. 3 million of those people who have been forced out of their homes are still sitting in camps today. There was an international outrage early on. Unfortunately, soon the attention faded out. Media stopped covering Darfur. Politicians stopped talking about Darfur, even though the international community has taken several steps that's supposed to be helpful. Referring the case to the International Criminal Court, deploying United Nations African Union mission to Sudan to protect the people of Darfur. Unfortunately, the government of Sudan has used so many strategies. First, internally, to use military means to solution versus negotiated peace, and by recruiting more militaries and buying more weapons to kill its own people. Using another approach to divide the international community among themselves between supporters of Sudan and opponents of Sudan, and the victims are yet neglected completely again. So in 2011, after the Comprehensive Peace Agreement was signed, the peace that granted independence for South Sudan, unfortunately, it has been violated. No one talk about Sudan's clear violation of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. They cut the agreement into different pieces. They renegotiated the agreement again, took Abyei, the oil-rich region. They took South Kordofan and the Blue Nile, and they started attacking the people in South Kordofan and the Blue Nile again. So while they are doing this, they divided the Sudanese people across regional, geographic, ethnic, and political lines. So when they are killing the people of Darfur, the people of South Kordofan, and even the Southern Sudanese before, the rest of Sudanese were totally doing their business as usual because they think that doesn't consider them, or either these people may have a guilt against the government. That's why the government was doing that to them. And they took advantage of that and continue to use the same approach everywhere in Sudan. People in eastern Sudan were granted a peace deal. They're not in peace, they're not in war, but situations there is really there. People die from preventable disease today in eastern Sudan. With the crisis going on in Darfur, that resulted in genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And the attack and ethnic cleansing in South Kordofan and the Blue Nile, 2/3 of the country's population become dependent on aid assistance. These are farmers and herders and civil servants who have been actively working and contributing to supporting their livelihood and supporting the country. Darfur was the number one that bring hard currency to Sudan because we export gum arabic. 80% of the world total export comes from Darfur. We export cash crop like sesame, karkare, and so many other crops to outside of Sudan. We have cotton, Jazeera scheme. They killed the scheme, displaced the people from them. So when this happened, then the second factor is that with the government using a military approach to solution, the military budget had the highest level in history. So over 80% of the country's budget goes to military. 5% goes to health, less than 5% goes to education. Can you imagine? With that kind of situation, the suffering has entered into every single Sudanese household. And then when human rights activists and journalists start speaking up, the response was the same as in Darfur, killing people in the capital Khartoum, arresting lawyers, journalists, students from Darfur were systematically killed and picked out and dismissed out of universities in groups, in masses, like 200, 300 students will be dismissed in one day, and they never go back. They forced many millions, nearly 1.5 million out of the country. Right now, most of them live in deplorable situation in Chad, Central African Republic, Libya, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, Ghana, name it. most of these countries are experience crisis again, and Sudanese become the most victimized in that kind of situation. So with that situation, then everyone came to realization that the reason for all of this is this government, and then they came together and demanded that change must take place in Sudan, and the hope was high. People dream where demand are just and simple. They wanted peace. They want a society where they can all live equal. Unfortunately, I do think this brutal dictator, the military government, and our regional players and neighbors have stolen the dream of the Sudanese people. In the beginning, when al-Bashir was forced out, the National Military Transitional Military Council was very responsive to people's demand. They nominated the defense minister. People refused. He stepped down. And they nominated these two people. People said, we don't want military in place. We want a civilian government. And they were willing to negotiate. Guess what? Saudi government, Emirates, and Egypt stepped in. Saudi and Emirate government have pledged a huge amount of money. $3 billion is huge to these military guys. And when we talk about Bashir has been indicted for genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, he did not act it alone. Hemeti Mohammed Hamdan, who is the deputy of the head of the Transitional Military Council, is the commander in charge. When Bashir was commander-in-chief, he was a commander-in-charge. Al-Burhan is the first person at national level to recruiting these militias and bringing not only people from Sudan, but from Chad, Central African Republic, Niger, and Mali, and just name it. Sudan today became, it's not for Sudanese. So many people who have come, the original Sudanese have lost their citizenship because of the burning of their homes. But these new Sudanese, they have the full fledged of everything that they can control in Sudan. The streets in Sudan become militarized. So when these people came on board, the Saudi government and Emirati government gave money to this military council, and they wanted to keep them, that they say they want a strong military presence in Sudan. That's the only guarantee that Sudan will remain alive. So unfortunately, because of that, and then we heard that there are allegations that also the Emirate government invited some of the opposition and paid them money. So they create some sort of mistrust among the opposition group, the Freedom and Change Forces. They know that the protester will not accept that. The day that this recent incident had happened, it was the day in which they were very close to agreement. And they were talking about an Emirati intelligence high level was in Khartoum and was talking back and forth to this military guy. So unfortunately, this was the stolen hope. But the other international community, international players were also not immune to what had happened in Sudan. When Bashir is granted immunity for genocide, these guys learn one thing, that if you can hold strongly into power, then you can get away with murder. Whatever you do, you can get away with it. And that started not now, but when the United States, under the Obama administration, was constantly working with Sudan and trying to negotiate normalization of relations, even though the president is an indicted war criminal. And in 2016, the European Union has declared this very controversial refugee policy. People in the United States, they talk about refugee issues, they don't talk about Europe refugee policies. They went into Sudan and allied themselves with the government of Sudan to help them to curb the flow of African refugees to Europe. How many governments in the region that can do better? There are so many refugees in Uganda. There are so many refugees in Kenya, in Egypt. Why Sudan? They gave billions of euros to the government of Sudan to work with them to block the Libyan borders. These other refugees are fleeing their persecution from their own countries, like Eritrean, Somalian, Ethiopian, and other in our neighbor. Do you expect that a government like Bashir's government, with this military group, will protect the right of these refugees? Of course, no. So because of that, they signaled that even though the European Union where the court is sitting is okay with Bashir dealing with them instead of isolating Bashir and holding them accountable. So that has signaled into that, yes, if you can become a military person more powerful, as many people as you kill, you can be rewarded. And of course, China and Russia have been the historical allies of Sudan. But the recent Gulf state intervention is extremely dangerous. Sudan is right now in at the brink of collapse. And Sudan is expected to go two ways. Either people can insist constructive intervention and getting a civilian government in place to keep Sudan together, or either Sudan will be disintegrated soon, because the people are so frustrated when you see if you can only carry gun, you can have power in your country instead of go to court to have your right, then that will be another approach that we are actively advocating. Or either Sudan will become a hub for terrorists so that the current regional player and the international community that avoiding doing something right now, they will be forced to fight at that moment to keep the regional safe, and it is still impact the U.S. national interest. If that is what they are dealing with Sudan for right now, their national interest, it will be at stake. And I think the United States government need to take more leadership and make clear to their allies that they have to wait until we have a government in place before they can come and they dump money into these criminal military accounts. So it is very, very important. I will stop here and will be more than happy to take your questions.
Thank you. Something I forgot to mention earlier is that if you have any questions, please write them down and we'll get them sent up here. Thank you very much. On this note of the role that some Gulf states are playing in Sudan's very difficult transition, I'd like to ask you, Dr. Nabeel, to really touch on the influence of Abu Dhabi and Riyadh that we see in Sudan at this point.
All right. Very briefly, there's a struggle for power in the region. And essentially, the two big poles, Iran and Saudi Arabia, are competing for dominance in the broader Middle East. In that struggle, the rest of the countries in the region are seen as pawns, which victimizes them because their problems are not looked at as problems belonging to that country, but simply as to whether they fall into this camp or that camp. And the latest to be victimized by the struggle for power are Yemen and Sudan, literally the poorest countries in the region. Yemen, in absolute terms, the poorest country, is being totally devastated and destroyed. And Sudan, which could potentially be the breadbasket of the whole Arab world, instead of the rich countries investing in developing Sudan and helping it to play this leading role in the region, what they're doing is investing in security, investing in keeping the worst military elements of the country in charge of it so that they could control them. The balance of power in the region. Back in the 50s and the 60s, it used to be the monarchies led by Saudi Arabia versus the Arab nationalist socialist republics led by Nasser from 52 to 1970. And the monarchies essentially won that struggle with the defeat of the Arab nationalist forces in the 1967 war, and then the death of Nasser in 1970. So the monarchies began to feel confident after 1970, and the oil boom occurred and so on. 1979, however, comes the revolution in Iran, which places a Shiite Islamist group in charge of one of the largest and most powerful countries in the region. And until now, Saudi Arabia is still struggling with how to deal with this power. The other thing that happened that threatened the monarchies is the 2011 Arab uprising, sometimes called the Arab Spring. This was a direct threat because the Arab youth, for the first time across the region, were challenging despotism, were challenging corruption, and were seeking democracy and for the citizen, for the Arab citizen, to be properly treated by their authority. It also threatened to upset the balance because in that case, the Muslim Brotherhood stood possibly theoretically at the beginning of the uprising to gain. Because in many of these Arab countries, if the regime fell, the most organized opposition was usually the Muslim Brotherhood. Saudi Arabia and the Emirates entered the fray, again afraid about what the outcome of these uprisings might be. The only case where they were happy to see the regime toppled was in Libya, where Gaddafi was traditionally sparring always and considered an enemy by the royal family in Saudi Arabia. In other places, they tried to pick the right horse to in the race, so to speak, and intervened practically in every case, certainly in Syria, Yemen. Now, part of this is based on paranoia, a feeling that royalty was being challenged, monarchism was being challenged. The fear of being toppled as a monarchy in Saudi Arabia in particular goes back to the days of Nasser, because and as the saying usually goes, just because you're paranoid doesn't mean that they're not really after you. In the case of Nasser, he did want to overthrow the monarchy, but he failed and failed miserably over many fronts. But other than the paranoia, other than the fear of losing the balance of power for Iran, for the favor of Iran, or having all these young democratic advocates and activists turn on Saudi Arabia and the Gulf after they win power in their own countries. In 2015, you had the ascent of MBS in Saudi Arabia, essentially a new generation coming to power after you finished going through all the brothers, all the older sons of Abdulaziz. And between MBS and MBZ of the Emirates, they have been on a drive for aggressively asserting their right to lead the region. The UAE has been literally trying to develop a maritime empire. And if you see the ports that they have been after, it goes around from where the UAE is. Unfortunately, they have to skip Oman because Oman has been resistant to their pleas to fall in line. And they haven't had any aggressive designs on Oman yet. But you skip Oman and you go down to Yemen and you have Mukalla as a port. You have Socotra, which they have taken over. For what possible connection to the war with the Houthis? There is none, even if you tried very hard to come up with one. Essentially as a strategic location for maritime exploitation. And then you go to Aden, of course, and then you turn around Aden into the Red Sea, and you see bases now for the UAE in collaboration with Saudi Arabia, in Djibouti, in Eritrea, and in Sudan. Sudan has a very long coastline just across the pond, just across the waters from Saudi Arabia. So for part of it is that Sudan is being used as a source of fighting people They bring some of the former Janjaweed and others into Yemen to kill their fellow Arabs and Muslims and die, and they have been dying by the hundreds. For what? For a few dollars. So partly it's a resource for Saudi Arabia, and partly it feeds into their fears. With this latest uprising in Sudan, it harkens back. I mean, they say to themselves, you know, we just barely finished getting rid of the 2011 uprising, and here come the Sudanese to, again, revive it. And if a democratic movement succeeds in Sudan, it would have repercussions throughout the region, given that the spirit of the uprising of 2011 has not completely died down. It has just been suppressed and pushed down. And with a success in a large country like Sudan, it could revive the hopes. And this is a fear in both Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And given that the Sudanese are just across the pond, just across the Red Sea from the Saudis, you can see where something that thrives in Sudan might well spread into Saudi Arabia. So the rest of the region is a matter of where they can reach and where they cannot, but really they have been, in my opinion, overly ambitious. Saudi Arabia and the UAE are not traditionally militaristic countries. Saudi Arabia barely has an army. But they buy mercenary forces, they buy influence in various countries. And they are trying to, just what Trump keeps repeating about, and in Pompeo, about fighting Iranian influence in the region. They try to, I mean, the balance of power is that Iran is influential, if not dominant, in Lebanon, in Syria, certainly in Iraq. In other countries, it has some influence, but is not dominant. Even in Yemen, Iran is not dominant. It simply has some influence. But the Saudis and the Emiratis are challenging Iran in Syria. Lately, they are, poking their heads back after having failed in 2011 and 2012 to establish themselves there. They are trying again with the Sunni tribes in northeast Syria. And this, to me, is a stretch for them. They try along the coast in North Africa, but luckily places like Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia are a bit too far for them and a bit too resistant. So Egypt, they're happy to have Egypt, and it is under their control. And again, a military dictatorial regime is what they favor the most. And in Libya, it's still a toss-up, but their support is with General Haftar, who's certainly not a force for democracy in Libya. So there you have it. Sudan is, in the midst of all this, a place where the so-called Arab coalition of Saudi Arabia and UAE would like to have a dictator, a military person in charge, without any moral or human rights scruples. They don't care what he does to stay in power. They don't care what the Janjaweed or the former Janjaweed, now they're the Special Forces. RSF. Yes, RSF. RSF. They don't care what they do to their own people, as long as they maintain control, and they just offered them $3 billion in assistance, and they do what they're told by Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And there you have it. I think in the end, all this rush of testosterone is the only way to describe it, of the leadership of Saudi Arabia and the UAE will backfire. I think they're way overstretched, and they're paranoid, and that if they sit back and rationally consider that the balance of power in the region is not really all that much against them, And frankly, I mean, whether you like Iran or hate Iran, it doesn't matter. Objectively speaking, it's not Iran that's trying to upset the balance of power in the region. It's MBS and MBZ. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to turn right now to Professor Des Roches, who's going to talk to us about a new Cold War in the Arab world.
All right. Thank you. There we go. Thank you, Giorgio. I've got a brief public announcement. I'm going to stop. Today is the last day I will appear on a panel with Nabeel Khoury. Normally, he makes me look like a moron.
We just agreed on that.
Yeah,
so
we've
I'm
just
jo- I'm
agreed.
joining-
Yeah.
I'm joining
Normally,
the
I look like a
resistance.
moron because his presentation is just better, but it's not the same presentation I give. But today, it is the same. So this is just not good. And I have to start off by saying that I don't know the Sudan, and I've never been to the Sudan. I wanted to go for a very long time, and when I left the Army, I was going to be the attaché there. But it's just something that I've always missed out on. So what I am going to talk about, being a smart speaker, is what I know about the best, which is pretty much the Cold War, since I grew up in it. And this is my contact information if you want to follow me on Twitter or whatever. So first off, this book, The Arab Cold War, Gamal Abdel Nasser and His Rivals, if you haven't read this book, you just came here for the lunch. It's a classic. The guy who wrote it was the father of the Golden State Warriors, Steve Kerr, coach. He was also the first person assassinated when Lebanon started to circle the drain. He was the president of American University of Beirut. And as Nabeel has said, and I'm not going to say it anymore, I'm just stipulating it for the rest of my presentation. As Nabeel has said, in the 60s and up until really after his death, the inter-Arab dynamic was characterized by a sort of revolutionary power led by Gamal Abdel Nasser that constantly sought to overthrow the established monarchies or even the nascent republics such as they were. There were proxy wars. For a period of time, the Saudi Air Force was grounded because every time a plane took off, it would defect to Cairo. One of the things I've always wondered is whatever happened to those Saudis who defected to Egypt in the 60s. And I would love to talk to one of these guys and say, so let's talk about your life and how it worked out. We're seeing that same similar dynamic today, and a lot of the very same accusations and techniques like destabilizing role of Radio Cairo, you can substitute Al Jazeera, you hear the same thing. But what does a Cold War mean? Well, the first thing is that when we talk about the Cold War, we're really talking about the great post-World War II confrontation between the United States, its partners, the Soviet Union, and its partners. So the United States is in blue, the Soviet Union is in red. Some of these, purple doesn't show up very well, but there were some states that were contested in purple, and that's Chile, Somalia, Ghana, and there were some states that truly were neutral. But the important thing about the Cold War was, first off, there was no such thing as a marginal or unimportant state. There was no such thing as a failed state in the Cold War. And there was no such thing as a development project that was unimportant. So this man with the Deroshian haircut is Nikita Khrushchev. Does anybody recognize the gentleman with the sunglasses? That's right, Josip Broz Tito, a Croatian who desperately tried to make people think he was Serbian and managed to hold together Yugoslavia, this melange of different nationalities, religions, and languages, into a coherent republic. And he was able to do it because his country was important. And so he got things from the Soviet Union and he got things from the United States. And as soon as the Cold War ended, his country descended into chaos. Things like the failed state of Rwanda, the failing state of Somalia, impossible during the Cold War. As a matter of fact, during the Cold War, Ethiopia and Somalia were both on different sides. One country decided they wanted to go to war with the other. Their patrons wouldn't do it, and they literally shifted sides so they'd go to war with each other. They swapped the United States for the Soviet Union. and went at war. So there was no such thing as a failed state. This was good for some countries. I mean, I contend that without the Cold War, the high dam at Aswan would have never been built. When the United States said we're not going to fund it, the Soviet Union settled in. But of course, there are negative aspects to it. And what drives this dynamic is, quite frankly, and this is me and my younger brother, the fact that it was a zero-sum game. There's one ice cream cone, you either have it or you don't. If you have it, they don't. If they have it, you don't. And what that means is that every country in the world is important in the Cold War. And so if you have an Arab Cold War, there is no such thing as an insignificant country. If it's Yemen, if it's Sudan, everything's important, everything is valuable. So what we see right now, I think, is sort of a projection war. And basically it's Qatar supported by Turkey with some neutrals, Kuwait and Oman for the most part, against other countries. And of course, Yemen here is, I'm going with the established government, which I recognize their writ doesn't run, probably doesn't even run in Yemen, but there is an embassy and there is a government. It's mostly in Riyadh. Now, it's an open question, as Dr. Khoury said, as to whether or not this is created by, whether it's self-fulfilling prophecy due to internal paranoia. And I would point out that, for example, the Qatari armed forces took casualties fighting in Yemen, or at least coming back from the fighting in Yemen prior to the initiation of the kerfuffle, the blockade. So Qatar was actually an active participant in the war in Yemen, so it didn't have to be this way. But for whatever reason it is, and we all know, the purpose of this isn't to go through it, but we all know the panel of it, and one of them, of course, is the role of the Muslim Brotherhood or Muslim Brotherhood-like ideology. So what about Sudan? So this is a ranking of Arab League countries by wealth, and Sudan is towards the bottom. And considering the size of Sudan and the resources of it, it's one of the few countries in the Arab world that has people, water, farm space, and oil. It should be one of the richest countries in the Arab world, but it's not. And the reasons that our first speaker told us: war, systemic corruption, seemingly a pattern, a ruling strategy of carrying on ongoing civil wars in order to destabilize the periphery and preserve the importance of the core at the center of it. I'm sorry to get all University of London on you, but I am what I am. Now we look here at the population, and Sudan is towards the top, and Sudan is growing very quickly. You can see the annual population growth is very high, and it has one of the quickest doubling rates. The population doubles every 23 years. The only country that comes close in the Arab world is Oman, which actually exceeds it, Qatar, which is so small, and Bahrain. These are very small states, and Yemen, of course, which is poor. So you've got a lot of population. So whatever happens in Sudan is going to be very important to everybody else in the Arab world, just because of the fact that it's poor and it's got a growing population, and almost everybody sees that as a potential indicator of stress. So even absent any geopolitical or power politics concerns, this is an important country for the region. It has a potential to feed the region, as was previously noted. It also has the potential to destabilize the region. But here's where it gets really interesting, is when we start to talk about water. So the map is the catchment of the Nile Valley. And you can see that a large number of the dams on the Nile and potential areas for dams on the Nile are in Sudan, and a majority of the catchment area of the Nile is in Sudan. Indeed, if you look at the bar chart, the blue shows the amount of water that goes out, and the purple shows the amount of water that goes in. And what you can see is that Sudan is the one that comes closest to even. So basically, if Sudan were to try to utilize water to achieve all of its agricultural potential, it has all of the water coming in. It could drastically reduce the amount of water going out. Presumably that would be exported as virtual water, but I mean, geez, I'm from Los Angeles, man. That movie Chinatown about, with Jack Nicholson about secretly, that is real. That is a real thing, and water at the fundamentals of it is the basis of civilization, and you don't have to be Carl Weber to know that. And then, of course, you have Egypt, which is downstream from Sudan. It is a country of extreme water stress and also has an extremely large population and is poor and is getting poorer, and is viewed, I believe, by many in the Gulf as sort of the strategic reserve of manpower for the Arab world in the event of confrontation with Iran. So how do you preserve these interests? Well, the bases have been mentioned before. This is not a complete map of bases, but what you can see is that there is a series of bases being conducted, as well as Iranian ships at sea that are presumably conducting destabilizing operations. I had hoped, prior to the current imbroglio between the United States and Iran, there was actually a good news story, which was that an Iranian sailor on one of these ships had a medical emergency. Saudis evacuated him and treated him in a Saudi facility and returned him, even though this ship is probably poised there to run raids on Saudi shipping and lay mines. Unfortunately, that's one of those good news stories. That it's like the Germans and the British playing soccer in Christmas 1914. It's going to be forgotten. And Port Sudan remains an important point. It's one of the few ports in the on the African side of the Red Sea that actually has active railroad links into the interior, and because it was built by Canadians, as I always point out to everybody, for Lord Kitchener. But this is the big issue. This is really what scares people. And the idea is that you have a populist Islamist Egyptian leader coming and seizing power, just like the late Mohammed Morsi, and aligning himself along a manner of Turkey does that establishes, that threatens rather the established order in the regime. And you hear a lot about the Muslim Brotherhood in the region. I am aware that in many countries, to include most of the Gulf, the Muslim Brotherhood is a malign force, and it's certainly viewed as a malign force. But I would point out that why is it a malign force? What other options are there for peaceful expression of dissent or for that? I think that to a certain extent, if you close off every other option, you wind up with an unacceptable option. And certainly I think when I look at Al-Qaeda now, as different from ISIS, but Al-Qaeda, when I look at the leadership of Al-Qaeda, what I really see is Gamma Islamiyah Misriya. I see the Egyptian Islamic Jihad in absentia. And I blame Hosni Mubarak for that. Of course, you have now a strong man, my Army War College classmate, Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, in Egypt, and I think that the countries that are involved in this Cold War feel that they have to support them, even if they don't like him, even though they realize that he is becoming more repressive than even Mubarak ever was, and even though they don't see an end to this rat hole of subsidies and corruption and inefficiency that they have to throw money down, because it's a Cold War, and if they don't win, somebody else will, and everything is valuable by that. So, of course, Sudan becomes involved in that. There's a specter of popular uprising, as you saw in Tahrir Square, this threat that there could be a genuine popular uprising that will go beyond the realm of the established security state, that cannot be allowed to happen in Egypt, and that would happen in Egypt if it would be more likely to happen in Egypt if Egypt were to become destabilized either by example from Sudan, by water stress from a truly developed Sudan, or by hostilities with Sudan. Then, of course, there's the fact that there's an alternate model of development out here. During the post-World War II Cold War, really, there wasn't a whole lot of difference as to what the goal was. The goal was a better life for everybody in the world with some sort of political participation. Communism said we could deliver that better. The West said we could deliver that better. That argument was settled pretty decisively. But we were arguing over the means to achieve a common end. What we have now is the Chinese model, which I show you here. The Chinese model, and this has not been adequately studied or referenced, is an alternate goal. And I believe that our partners in the Gulf are leaning more towards that than ours, which is you can be rich, you can be developed, you can have happy people with cable and Burger King delivered and the
5G.
ability to go ice again?
And 5G.
Yeah, and 5G, that's right. 5G, yeah, very fast 5G. And no political participation. That you can have all the benefits of capitalism without the predicated political development for it. Now, the American vision is alternative. Does anybody recognize this man? Anyone? Bueller? This is General Pinochet of Chile, and he is casting a ballot. Now, he is in the West, in the United States in particular, and particularly among the kind of people who go to foreign policy panels on a Friday, he is more commonly associated with casting political dissidents out of helicopters than with casting a vote into a ballot box. But And this was the argument cited when Mike Pompeo and Jim Mattis went to tell Congress what was up with the Khashoggi case last year. Most of the countries in Latin America were authoritarian and turned into democracies eventually. If you look at a map of authoritarian governments in Latin America in the 70s, they were almost all authoritarian, and now they are almost all democracies. And the ones that are not democracies are not aligned with the West, they're aligned with socialist powers. So you have two goals here. The American government seems to be, or three rather, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and its partners say, look, we want to avoid chaos, we want to prevent not just Sudan, but from falling into chaos, but if Sudan goes down the tubes, Egypt will go as well, and that is unacceptable for us. The second thing is you have the development of an authoritarian model of government, and then the third thing is the United States and the West, for the most part, says we can remain engaged with authoritarian government, and eventually it will transition into something we want, and that is the only point I have to make that was not made by Nabeel Khoury, and on that I'm waiting for your questions.
Thank you. Before we turn to our last speaker, Dr. William, I want to say he's going to be leaving a bit early today. So if you have questions specifically for him, please send them up as soon as possible. I'm going to go ahead and turn the floor over to you.
I remember during my trip with Obama's science envoy to Riyadh, the Saudis had very carefully placed learning Chinese language books out on the table in front of us, and other coffee table books on China as they complained about U.S. relations. And so that was all,
subtle.
and that was reported back to the Obama White House. I'd also say that I shared an ice cream cone with my son yesterday, so I don't know if that's the right metaphor for a zero sum. We each ate half. We were happy, but anyway. I'd like to thank Giorgio and Jesse, in terms of my contact, for putting together a fantastic panel, Nabeel and David for covering all the important points, and Niemat for bringing a flavor of Sudan, what's actually going on in Sudan, because among many other things we need to learn more about in Sudan, it's the connection between the Janjaweed and the RSF and all these Sudan-specific elements, which is mostly what I'm going to focus on in the few minutes that I have. I'm not a Sudan expert. I'm a regional expert with 34 years experience, just got back from the region last week, and I'm on Al Hora at 1 o'clock to talk about the region, so that's why I'm racing off. My main point is this. While the protests in Sudan are quite similar to what we saw in the Arab Spring, having learned lessons from it, and in many ways similar to the Algerian protesters that have been making advances sort of in tandem and in conversation with the Sudanese protesters. The big difference between Algeria and Sudan and everywhere else is that the regime is very, very different and very, very fragmented. The word that Crisis Group used in its last report was fissiparous, which I had to look up. And they also talked about coup by committee, that the April 11th coup couldn't be done by one person or a small group. A larger group of Sudanese military had to be involved in the coup decision, which of course grew out of conversations with Abu Dhabi, Riyadh and Cairo prior to the coup, but still was a difficult decision within the Sudanese structure. And I'm reminded, as I always am in these fraught moments of political transition, of not bad Huntington 1992 or Huntington 1988, which you made an oblique reference to on Latin America, but Huntington 68, Political Decay, which was his best book about why tipping points usually go wrong. And it's the institutional weaknesses in Sudan and that special history of Sudanese institutions which makes this tipping point particularly fraught, and all of the warnings we've heard from this panel particularly important. While Cairo, Abu Dhabi, and Riyadh have a lot of common interests right now in a big sort of triangular Venn diagram, which you can argue how much it overlaps or doesn't overlap, I'd like to stress three differences which were alluded to among those three countries. I see UAE as more mercantile in its approach, and that was well evoked. I see Saudi Arabia as more hegemonic. And I see Egypt as more a bunker state, and with bunkerism as a mentality, to refer to Clem Henry's famous designation about Algeria. And that leads them in different directions. It's leading to different directions between Saudi Arabia and UAE in Yemen, and it's leading to differences in terms of the signaling that's being done to Sudan, the Sudan military. So that's something to keep in mind. Also, in terms of the power structure in Sudan, there's a discussion right now about whether Dagalo / Hemedti is the real. I mean, he made the first trip to the regional powers before Burhan did, or whether Burhan is the major power broker. But the important thing here is that there are many leaders in Sudan that don't like either one of them within the military, and would actually like to side with the opposition, which is why that whole deal with the opposition fell apart, because like in Algeria, and there are lots of differences and similarities between the two cases, but like in Algeria, there's a significant portion of the security services that are more or less aligned with the protesters, and then there's these other elements which aren't, and that's what caused the falling apart after the deal was almost struck with the opposition leaders. In terms of the Egyptian relationship and the Egyptian comparison, most of what I could say has already been said, but let me just add to it that Egypt's making public pronouncements, including its most recent statements at the African Union summit meetings that are going on the Sudan crisis. It's making very positive political statements, but if you read between the lines and understand what's going on in Egypt, its approach is a security-driven approach, not a politically driven approach, despite all the positive noises that it's making. And I would also underscore what was said about the water issue and about the Haddaib Triangle issue. There's a big disputed area because Egypt's going to look for advantages on a security, but also on borders and also on water, and it's going to try to extract concessions in line with its bilateral relationship. Let me also say that the comparison with Egypt is fraught. In terms of Egypt 2011, 2013, I think, because there are just way too many differences, notwithstanding the specter of the image that you put up. But I think the most important element of the comparison and the lesson learning that needs to be made is that Egypt wants Sudan not to have a one-year Morsi-type interregnum. They're avoiding at all costs. And the protesters in Sudan know this, which is one of the reasons they don't want elections. And one of the reasons Crisis Group is saying, let's not have elections. Sudanese protesters have figured out that, and like the Algerian protesters, that if we can skip the election step, then we don't have this risk. And so they're trying to get to a transitional civilian government without the step of elections, which is problematic in terms of democratic practice and AU principles, but seems to be a reasonable lesson learned strategy from the Egyptian case. Turning to Libya briefly, let me say that one of the reasons Sudan's in the situation it's in regionally is the Arab Spring and the fall of Gaddafi. Gaddafi was a big supporter of the previous configuration in Sudan. And since Libya fell apart, Sudan has very interestingly been siding with different factions and having disputes with different factions in Libya, to the point that the Sudanese piece of the puzzle is frequently mentioned in the Libyan press and among Libyan leaders. And let me also say, in terms of the comparison, the specter of Libya is the one that's being used at the AU and being used in other discussions as what could go wrong in Sudan on this panel as well. And there's a definite chance that we could have a fragmentation a la Libya, and which everyone would like to avoid. Let me also say that it's notable in terms of Algeria, Sudan, which is another piece I looked at for this panel, that Algeria has not joined the Saudi Arabia coalition, notably along with Iraq and a few other countries, and is taking a very anti-Saudi stand as interventionist, as hegemonic, and so That's interesting. Algeria was long blamed Sudan for meddling in its own internal affairs, and now sees an opportunity through the AU and other mechanisms to improve its regional situation by supporting a better transition in Sudan. Now, the Algerians have another important set of differences, actually. One is that the Algerian regime has a revolutionary ideology and a revolutionary legacy. Sudan has a simulacrum of one, but they're really not being driven by revolutionary ideology, and that kind of weakens what the regime can do. The Sudanese protesters, as I've said in the media several times, are much better organized than the Algerian protesters. So that's a plus for Sudan. The problem is that the main variable in the situation is not what the protesters do, although it's important, and I've talked about it. It's what the regime does in the end, and it's the weaknesses of the Sudanese regime in power right now that makes me very concerned about what will happen going forward. There are many things we could talk about. My previous panelists have mentioned them, but let me just add to that mix. Since 1955, Sudan's been at war for 47 years of it. So almost everything bad that comes out of Sudan's institutional frameworks, historical memory, and sort of governing framings comes from that legacy of internal conflict. That's what makes the Janjaweed/RSF what it is. That's what makes the regime worried about what it's worried about, and that gives it that bunker state mentality that Sisi supports. And to quote a friend of mine I was discussing this yesterday with, that means that this regime, if provoked, will stop at nothing to assert itself militarily in a way also that the Algerian regime seems unwilling to do right now. A concluding note in terms of the U.S. piece of this. I wrote for the Arab Center a year ago, in the year after Trump. A year into the Trump administration's foreign policy, in my article on North Africa, and in reference to Sudan, about what I call the Goldilocks principle, which we saw another example of it last night, where the Trump administration goes hot and the Trump administration goes cold, and then it sort of ends up in the middle again. And that happened on Iran again. It went hot, it went cold, and now we're sort of back to where, I'm saying this is a good way to go, but it's almost predictable that the Trump administration will usually end up where what I call George W. Obama was on most issues, and had been on Sudan, in that the first year of the Trump administration, the U.S. continued to certify Sudan on humanitarian grounds and include them in regional military maneuvers, despite the fact that Sudan was still on the terrorism list. So we're out moving ships around and training with Sudanese forces that they're supposedly terrorists, right? And this was that pragmatic, Pentagon-driven approach to the problems, which is continuing to end up being what the Trump administration does in the end after trying out all the other wrong possibilities. And so let me conclude by saying that there's a opportunity here. Just like when Trump made that stupid phone call to Haftar in Libya, and then backtracked and let the government take over the Libya relations. The ship got righted again, just like when the U.S. got it wrong on Sudan, and then got it right again by letting the sort of Pentagon-driven way go. There was a recent move where Assistant Secretary Nagy retook over the Sudan account and called for an investigation into the June 3rd killings, offered U.S. mediation in addition to what they call the AU, the presidency, IGAD, and the three-part, the council, the U.S. mediation. And I would argue that